Hello and welcome to our Week 5 supplemental lecture on C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. This is a piece that you probably can read without the assistance of the podcast. It's not that difficult, although some of its references will feel a little bit dated to us today. It doesn't exactly reflect probably how we think of either the natural sciences or the humanities. But we're reading it this week, even though it is considerably older than most of the other pieces that we'll look at, because the phrase "the two cultures" has become a general shorthand, even from people who haven't read this piece, to describe the difference in attitudes and values and belief structures between the sciences and the humanities. And so you'll see the phrase "the two cultures" pop up as a shorthand, and it's always good to go back and read where that came from and what the actual claims were. The version of this that you have available to you on Blackboard contains several pieces. It's only the first one that's assigned, and so you don't have to read the entire expanse that's up there. But let's cover the bit that we're meant to read for this week. So Snow's going to talk about the mutual incomprehension of two spaces that he straddles. So he's trained as a scientist, he works as a writer, and he moves between both literary and scientific spaces. And so he confronts on a sort of an everyday basis the ways in which these two different spaces misunderstand each other. He says, "I believe the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups. At one pole we have the literary intellectuals, who incidentally, while no one was looking, took to referring to themselves as intellectuals, as though there were no others. At the other, scientists, and at the most representative the physical scientists. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes, particularly among the young, hostility and dislike, but most of all, lack of understanding." And he talks about the stereotypes of scientists by non-scientists, that the scientists seem brash and boastful, that they seem sort of arrogant, and also that they seem shallowly optimistic and unaware of man's condition. Okay, so the belief that you can do something about problems in the world, that there are things that can be solved, and they can be solved by the tools of science. And this is viewed as naive in a certain literary circle, Snow believes. And then scientist stereotypes of literary intellectuals, that they're lacking in foresight, that they're unconcerned for their fellow humans, that they're anti-intellectual in a profound way, and that they're anxious to restrict both art and thought to what Snow calls the existential moment. Now again, there are fashions in these spaces, so some of the specific references Snow is making here probably won't resonate as much now as they did when he was writing, but if you read some of the more recent pieces this week as well, you can make a case that a similar sort of mutual incomprehension exists, even if the exact terms of the stereotypes aren't quite the same. And he talks about political orientations and political implications of these two cultures. So he talks about the ways in which scientists are misunderstood, and he says the primary misunderstanding is to assume that the sort of optimism that is characteristic of scientists applies to individual people rather than to the possibility to do something socially or on a more global scale. And he says scientists are no more optimistic than anybody else when it comes to thinking about the individual condition. It's the social condition that they think can possibly be intervened in and that holds potential. He says, "Each of us is solitary, each of us dies alone, all right, that's a fate against which we can't struggle. But there's plenty in our condition which is not fate, against which we are less than human unless we struggle." And you'll hear echoes of this in some of the more politically charged criticisms of the humanities in some of the other pieces this week. So these are people who think that there's a political failing underlying some of the criticism of science. Whether those articles or Snow get it quite right or quite understand what the criticisms are, you can judge by taking a look at some of the other readings for this week. Snow says, "Most of our fellow human beings, for instance, are underfed and die before their time. In the crudest terms, that is the social condition. There is a moral trap which comes through the insight into man's loneliness. It tempts one to sit back, complacent in one's unique tragedy, and let the others go without a meal." Okay, so a strong commitment to the material improvement of other people in possibly other parts of the world or other sections of one's own society through the application of scientific knowledge. As a group, he says, the scientists fall into that trap less than others. They are inclined to be impatient and see if something can be done until it's proved otherwise. That's their real optimism, and it's an optimism the rest of us badly need. Now again, some of the readings from last week had different sorts of criticisms, not this sort of criticism, but a criticism that science may not know enough to intervene, a criticism that it may be doing damage through its interventions, a criticism that it may be intervening in the wrong ways. You had authors that were worrying about technologies that cause war or that increase the damage of war. You had people worrying about environmental degradation. That doesn't seem quite to be captured in what Snow's talking about here, but he is capturing a flashpoint in the debate that we're looking at this week, where there's certainly components of the scientific community who are worried that fashionable critiques of science are undermining our ability to solve particular material problems. And then he talks about misunderstandings of literary intellectuals by scientists. He talks about the question that is asked whether prominent literary intellectuals were not only politically silly, but politically wicked. Didn't the influence of all they represent bring Auschwitz that much nearer? And this is one of these peculiar things in this debate, that you actually have both sides of it accusing the other of having done something that paved the way for the Holocaust and for the murderous nature of the Soviet Union. So science gets blamed, and we saw some of this in our Week 2 readings, by people who emphasize the industrial, technological prerequisites of these kinds of mass massacres. Humanities, philosophies, literary intellectuals can get blamed by people who think that it's a particular romantic form of thought that paves the way for these kinds of activities. And again, we saw a little bit of that in our Week 2 readings as well. Snow says, look, sure, there's a strand in the humanities, there's a strand in literature that seems to do this. Literature does change over time. You can't say that it's characterized solely by one thing. It changes over time, although possibly more slowly than the sciences. And Snow says it's because it lacks the automatic corrective that the sciences possess. He doesn't spell out what he has in mind by that, but presumably it's the attempt to both test ideas against empirical evidence and the culture of contestation, the sort of thing that Popper talked about in our reading last week, that tends to catch errors and correct them. And then he says, isn't it too simplistic to talk in terms of two cultures, only two cultures? You know, how widespread are these cultures? How diverse are they internally? And he says that in the end, though, it captures something that's quite important that a more differentiated account might not capture. He says, science is definitely a culture, and this is in spite of the fact that fields may know relatively little about other fields and that there are substantial differences depending on whether you're a biologist or a chemist or a physicist. But he says, across all of these diversities within science, common attitudes, common standards and patterns of behavior, common approaches and assumptions. This goes surprisingly wide and deep. It cuts across other mental patterns, such as those of religion or politics or class. If I were to risk a piece of shorthand, I should say that naturally they had the future in their bones. Without thinking about it, they respond alike. This is what a culture means. And he goes through examples in this section about scientists with different religious commitments or different class backgrounds, but nevertheless sharing more in common as scientists than what differentiates them from the other in these other aspects of their identity. He says literary culture is more diverse, but it's united by a particular thing, and he thinks that thing is a complete ignorance of and verging on hostility towards science. He says, but I believe the pole of total incomprehension of science radiates its influence on all the rest meaning this huge diversity within literary culture, but it's united by incomprehension of science. That total incomprehension gives, much more pervasively than we realize living in it, an unscientific flavor to the whole traditional culture. And that unscientific flavor is often much more than we admit on the point of turning anti-scientific. The feelings of one pole become the anti-feelings of the other. If the scientists have the future in their bones, then the traditional culture responds by wishing the future did not exist. It is the traditional culture, to an extent remarkably undiminished by the emergence of the scientific one, which manages the Western world. And again, thinking to some of the other readings that we've taken a look at in the last several weeks, this is a radically different perception of what is dominant. Think of Feyerabend from last week, who's convinced that science is so utterly dominant, nothing contests it. This is saying actually that an anti-scientific, or at the very least an incomprehending of science, sort of elite, is what is actually in charge. It is the opposite of the kind of technocratic conception of who rules that drives a lot of critical expressions. And this will have interesting implications, because if you don't think science is dominant at all, you're probably not even going to get what a lot of the critiques are talking about. And if you don't get that science feels itself somewhat beleaguered and doesn't identify with who's in charge, you're going to think that it's an overpowering, dominating force. So there may be two cultures in a slightly different way than Snow is thematizing that we can pick out of some of the readings we've been doing the last few weeks. And he says this divide between the two cultures hurts both cultures, it hurts both sides. He says, you get scientists who engage with literary works, but they're doing it as Snow calls it, touching their caps to the traditional culture. He says the whole literature of traditional culture doesn't seem to them relevant to their interests. And he says, they are, of course, dead wrong. As a result, their imaginative understanding is less than it could be. They are self-impoverished. Okay, so he thinks that science loses something that could stimulate its imagination and therefore its insights, its capacity for creativity. But he thinks that what's going on in the other side is worse, that what it's missing or lacking in its incomprehension of science damages it more. And in part he thinks it's because of a particular self-confidence that that scientific dimension isn't needed, isn't important. He says, they still like to pretend that the traditional culture is the whole of culture, as though the natural order didn't exist, as though the exploration of the natural order was of no interest, either in its own value or its consequences, as though the scientific edifice of the physical world was not in its intellectual depth, complexity, and articulation the most beautiful and wonderful collective work of the mind of man. Yet most non-scientists have no conception of that edifice at all. Even if they want to have it, they can't. It's rather as though over an immense range of intellectual experience a whole group was tone deaf, except that this tone deafness didn't come by nature, but by training, or rather the absence of training. Okay, and again, a lot of people who are inspired by this critique become very, very heavily invested in education, and in science education in particular, because they think that this is the issue, that the problem is not an understanding of science and then criticism of it, but just a lack of knowledge. And this is one of the flashpoints in the debates over science and its social status and power. And he gives a couple of examples, and again, he's got a scientific training, he's floating around in literary circles, and he's frequently in areas where people are kind of at cocktail parties and such, it sounds like from the piece, sort of mocking scientists. And he says, once or twice I've been provoked, and I've asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold, it was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of have you read a work of Shakespeare's? Okay, so basic incomprehension and lack of knowledge, he thinks. And he says, I now believe that if I'd asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. Okay? It's also interesting in light of the Weber reading from last week, where Weber talks about the fact that this is in fact one of the hallmarks of modernity, that we don't need to understand the guts of how things work that we need in our everyday lives. We just need to have a particular disenchanted attitude toward it. Snow is worrying that if we don't have some sense of at least the fundamentals of how it works, we'll slip back into a kind of enchanted way of interacting with things. And Snow thinks that, again, this is where many people go coming out of this critique, that the problem is specialization in education. He says there seems then to be no place where the cultures meet. I'm not going to waste time saying that this is a pity. It's much worse than that. He thinks that we lose the insights that could come from clashes of perspectives. So these two spheres are not interacting with each other, and so they can't serve as a check on each other. And again, this isn't miles away from the Habermas that we were looking at in the second week, where Habermas is worried that you get specialized spheres that differentiate themselves out. He doesn't think that's harmful in and of itself, but the fact that there's no way for the insights of that specialization to come back into everyday culture so that everyday culture can interact with it and absorb it and have some way to kick back on it critically and connect it to everyday life, that's a problem. And that's sort of the sort of problem that's being talked about here as well. And so he thinks that educational specialization creates barriers to meaningful exchange between the two cultures, and they just get farther and farther and farther apart, and he doesn't see anything good coming of that. Now that's where this chapter ends, and that is what's assigned for this week. In the additional chapters, if you're thinking about writing an essay on this area and you want to do a little bit more reading, he goes on to continue reflecting on the impacts of educational specialization. He gives some particular attention to the Cold War and how that impacts the drive to specialization, and also the legacy of the British Empire and its collapse and the impact that that has. And he's concerned more explicitly in the later chapters with resource shortages, disparity between wealthy and poor nations, and the need for the West to facilitate development. And he is very worried about the development of anti-technological attitudes. He talks about the Luddites and modern Luddites, Luddites being people who were going to tear down machines because of the perception that they were harming workers and taking jobs. And he's also worried about developmental notions that are happy to conclude that some peoples are sort of naturally behind others and not ready for the benefits of advanced technologies. And this particular politics is going to play out in a number of our readings this week as well. So there's a feeling that science is progressive and is able to do something to address the material issues that confront populations worldwide, whereas the critique of it strikes at least some scientists as extremely insular and parochial and a defense of the privilege of the core in the guise of a critique of science.